Welcome to the Faith Trends Podcast, conversations that connect research with ministry.
Okay, so I can't only just be looking at what people want.
That's right.
I guess that's kind of how it rolls, right? The market looks for what people want. Doctors sometimes look for what people need, right?
Yeah.
And so sometimes we just have to be the people who are going like, well, whether you like it or not, maybe a spoonful of sugar will help the medicine go down, but we have to make sure the medicine gets in there as well.
Today on the Faith Trends Podcast, we're joined by Mark Jolicoeur and Elias Domer. Mark, whom we've had on the podcast before, is a worship leader in Moncton, New Brunswick. Elias is also a worship leader who has experience in the recording and marketing world. Mark and Elias are part of a collaborative research study that's focused on trends in contemporary worship music and the attitudes and behaviors of local church leaders towards them. Stay tuned after our conversation with Mark and Elias when Lindsay and I will have our own discussion processing what we've heard in the interview.
Welcome, Mark and Elias, to Faith Trends. You know, the two of you have been part of a great research initiative related to the world of Christian worship music. Now, Mark, you've come on to talk with us back in episode 5, so you've been on before, and we talked about the life cycle of worship songs. And Elias, you're a first-time guest, but no stranger to the podcasting and recording world, so welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, so the two of you are part of this research collaborative that has done some work with the data on worship music trends, and you've gathered that through music databases like CCLI and Praise Charts. Now, I think it was in your email to us, Mark, where you said that the latest findings have been rattling more than a few cages. So please tell us, what is it about this research that people are finding unsettling?
Well, first of all, thanks a lot for having us. We're excited to be here.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the things is that we discovered early on is that research is one thing, but then how you deliver the research is a whole other thing. And so the initial findings, I mean, we've been dealing with this stuff for like coming on 2 years. And so a lot of the stuff is not new to us. We've been kind of chewing with it and wrestling through it. But it kind of leaked out, didn't really leak out, it kind of more exploded out in a tweet that was a link to an article. And that article itself was a reframing, you might even say, of our own research. And so the way that it kind of hit the world was on like matter, antimatter, kind of a collision. So that is what kind of helped rattle the cages for the people. Now, the content itself, what we actually can kind of back up, is rattling, I think, for some people. And then it's also actually, for other people, completely confirming of what they've already suspected. So it's kind of like, it really depends upon what your frame of reference was kind of going into it. But yeah, like the initial research that we put out, so we essentially have 2 phases. The first phase is we're kind of calling song volume analysis. And then the second one is attitudinal stuff, where we actually kind of got into surveys with people and we're kind of talking about how people responded and how they answered those questions. But in the first one, we came out with one finding, and we've got another one that's coming out in the next little while here. But the first one was really quite simple, is that, as you already mentioned, when we analyze CCLI charts and Praise charts, so the kind of top songs from those, and kind of look at the songs that happen to be kind of peaking on those charts, we ended up with 38 songs in the decade that we looked at. So the decade 2010 to 2020, there were 38 songs that made it into the top 25 of both of those charts. In the past, a lot of people have done a lot of work with CCLI, but the one reason that we tried to bring in Praise charts in this one was to try to, as best as we were able to kind of diversify the kind of churches that might be represented by that. So that was actually, something we tried. So if you look at those songs, with the very few exceptions, they all were directly tied to 4 different mega churches. And then even with those few exceptions, as the kind of the follow-up article that we released out, even though they might look like they're exceptions, the individual stories of even those exceptional songs tie back to the story of those mega churches. And so it was, for some people, like I kind of already explained, like, oh yeah, that makes total sense. But for other people, it was almost, the verge of outrage that this could possibly be the case. And so we just reported what we saw and let people kind of make those observations, I guess.
Okay, so what you're saying is that there's a concentration of music sources. What might be wrong with that?
I think it probably really depends. I mean, people have raised the question of whether or not this is consistent with the rest of history. I mean, so in addition to being a recording artist, I was in a band called the City Harmonic. I make music now. I've run a marketing agency 15, 16 years now. The reality is in almost every industry, you're going to see a concentration of production in a few players across the board. That's always going to be true, or at least it always has been true, whether it always will be or not. I guess I would say my understanding of our data, and this is, of course, as a guy who's worked in marketing, is that this probably says more about the average worship leader planning set lists than it says about the producers themselves. We have a tendency to say there must be some worship leader cabal out there of these people who are dominating and controlling the narrative of everything. Whether or not that's true, I don't know. I know many of the people involved, and the people I know are great, but it just really depends on how you want to view this. But it definitely says something about how we worship pastors, worship leaders, and planners look to these sources and the degree to which we've sort of outsourced our thinking on how we do what we do to them. And so I think part of what motivates me in this, I can't speak for Mark, of course, and this is a collaborative project, but like part of what motivates me is kind of unpacking what you might call the mythos of the worship music industry and allowing the truth of what it is to be the thing that we embrace it for and to go from there. I mean, as a worship writer, it's important to me that we view the people on both sides of this equation as human beings. And I think all too often we look to these brands, if you will, as if they're doing something they aren't necessarily always doing. And so I think the concentration, people think about it in terms of fairness. People think about it in terms of, access and things like that. And there's definitely a conversation to be had there. But for me, the more interesting part is what it says about us.
So here's a question, and this is more of a historical question. I know that's not part of your research, but
yeah,
it seems to me that in the past, if you flip open a hymn book, you'll see a lot of hymns by Charles Wesley or Isaac Watts or Fanny Crosby. Was there something similar going on in the past, or did people complain that, oh no, another Charles Wesley hymn?
Oh, yeah. I mean, so we actually have an article coming out very soon from Adam Perez, who's the historian on our team. So this is a question we've had often. The reality is that while, like I said, there have always been a few people doing a lot of the output in the domain of worship music, what's different is the interfacing and relationship between these entities in the industry and the manner in which they're doing it. So basically, Fanny Crosby was a hymn writer who wrote hymns and sent them off to a publisher who published those hymns in a hymnal which was sold. Right? So it's basically a different industry than, say, at this point, Bethel, which is transparently a record label, signing a worship leader from somewhere else in the country and working through their direct distribution and label services deal with one of the big four in the music industry. So we're talking about a very different kind of funnel, a very different sort of way that even the work is monetized. So this raises more questions than answers. But if you think about one buying a hymnal might buy 200 worship songs, and presumably those 200 worship songs need to cover a bevy of topics and theological concepts. Whereas if the main means of monetization for a record label is going to be streaming licensing, so payments from Spotify and Apple and so on, well, that's going to affect the prioritization of themes and music and other things like that. And so we don't have all the answers to that at this point. There's a lot of people doing good work in that area, but it certainly raises questions about what we think the thing is versus what it is. And actually, I think this question is a perfect example of that. It's saying, hey, wait, isn't this the same as hymns? And that takes for granted that the industry doesn't have some direct relationship with how the things get made.
Okay, that's interesting. Now, another key piece that you had said in, I think, the article or a presentation that I was working through was the release of singles directly impacts a song's popularity. So, for those of us who are new to the idea of the music publishing and recording world and that sort of pipeline, what does that mean? And why does releasing singles make a difference?
I want to say, even if we can back up, like the way that you framed the previous question, which is a wonderful question, and all these questions are, but was why is it a bad thing? And so I just want to say, we're not actually saying that it is. So that's actually part of the thing, is we are not trying to make evaluative statements on whether this is a bad thing or a good thing. We are trying to show you how things are. And so that's our role here. Now in podcast conversations, hey, we can theorize and we can kind of shoot from the hip a little bit. It's all well and good. But I just want to be clear that there is no, when we release the information, regardless of how a news agency may report it, we are not releasing any sort of revolutionary, manifesto or anything like that. This is contrary to that. That would be a good little tagline for you, Elias. Have you thought about writing a song called Manifesto? That'd be great.
Yeah, the word's a bit tired.
So that's not the point. Really, we're just trying to, and so similarly along this line, we're trying to talk about singles and kind of like therefore we're saying that you shouldn't release worship songs as singles. No, we're not trying to say that. We're just trying to show you kind of how this is currently working to the best of our understanding. So Elias has some pretty good insight on me.
Right. Well, that's a great transition, actually. When we first discussed the importance of singles, so ahead of the Duke presentation, we were throwing around different ways of approaching this. And statistically, it was similarly dominant. So in other words, after 2015, every song that appeared to be very successful in the CCLI charts was a single. And so the question became, is this a sort of causal thing? Now, me being on the industry side laughed because it was like, well, no, it's not causal. Every song is a single now. That's how it works. What it does really, really highlight, and this is part of what we're exploring. Again, we don't have answers to this yet, but it indicates a shift in philosophy. And I think that it begins to say, hey, we are doing, which is not a bad thing necessarily, but we are doing the things which work the best in the infrastructure for as it is. So if Spotify wants us to release a single every 28 days, we're going to release a single every 28 days. And that's what the system is going to kind of optimize for, right? On the surface, it's sort of like saying that every hit record in the 80s was on tape. Like it's kind of a duh sort of thing. But you take a step back and it does raise some interesting questions. I think if you think of the 80s and 90s and even old hymnals, there was sort of this idea that the primary thing that these products were to us were resources which were coming presumably from these movements of writers and churches, which had sort of played out and tested these songs. So there was a little bit of like social proof built in to the receiving of songs. And that's not to say that that's not happening now. It's just that we need to acknowledge, at least, I think, that there is sort of this relationship between how the industry functions in general and the sorts of things that are getting made and shared. And I think that's what singles highlights.
Earlier we were talking about the difference between releasing a hymn book and a single. And I think that there is something interesting going on here because, as you say, when you release a hymn book, it's maybe 2, maybe 3 or 400 hymns. But usually those hymn books are structured into topics like might be the seasons of the church calendar or topics like soteriology or whatever. But all of that indexing was really a signal to those planning worship that these were topics that should come up in your worship, either because it was indicated by the time of year or even just to flip open the index would be a prompt. Have I thought about soteriology? Have I thought about assurance, grace, those kinds of things? It seems to me that whatever hits in a single, obviously there's no breadth to topic once you hit the single. And where is the sort of breadth of Christian teaching that's communicated through music coming? Before we had a hymn book editor, is there a singles editor who is looking after worship music?
No, but so that's an easy one. So I mean, in fairness, just because we're describing what the top songs are, does not mean we're describing what all the songs are. Right? Like again, we have to keep kind of pushing back on this a little bit, which is to say, so Mike Tapper, who is on the team, and Shannon Baker, who's also on the team. Well, we've already mentioned Adam Perez. We've all put a lot of work into this, and so one of the things that you're going to see is, at least theorizing, one of the potential benefits, hey, let's talk about some upswings. And I think this even came up last time that we chatted, was that if you have a really wide array of people that are singing the same songs, it does kind of bode in some respects well about almost this kind of common hymnal that we're kind of singing from. But when you get down into the lower numbers, when you get down into the 35s and then down to the 99s and then things that are not even on charts. I mean, like I sing a song at my church that I'm pretty sure that you guys wouldn't know, and probably likewise at each of your churches, right? And so it's not saying that because the top songs are the ones that seem to have the widest reach, it does not mean that people aren't also getting into the depth of the back pages of the hymnal, as it were, when it comes to looking for those things. Now, probably the reason that this potential fear rings true is that a lot of us have at least gone to churches where we're noticing that they're always pulling from the same section of the hymnal, as it were. I guess part of what we're looking at is the market. If the market is driving what is happening, and market is driving thus popular worship songs, you're bang on, Rick. And the idea is that most people are going to be drawn towards certain songs that make them feel certain ways. This is where you take your kind of analyst hat off and then go just like Elias and I are both worship pastors, in some respects, worship leaders. Okay, so I can't only just be looking at what people want. I guess that's kind of how it rolls, right? The market looks for what people want. Doctors sometimes look for what people need. And so sometimes we just have to be the people who are going like, well, whether you like it or not, maybe a spoonful of sugar will help the medicine go down, but we have to make sure the medicine gets in there as well.
Yeah. And to kind of build on that, I think one of the reasons that we selected for the top 25 is that the top 25 in most cases is probably, like Mark said, not always, but probably what it feels like to sing in a church for the average person. So in other words, that top 25 songs is likely responsible for something like 85 to 90% of consumption in the space. So the vast majority of the songs being sung on Sundays are probably from among those top 25 at any given time. There will always be one or two that are not in that list. And I think what Mark's picking up is, I think, true, that beyond that top 25, it probably gets a lot more idiosyncratic. And you start to deal with the peculiarities of theological traditions and that sort of thing. And so they end up opting for different sorts of songs to fill those gaps, and it doesn't surprise me then that they don't have the same groundswell. But if you want to look at it as a sum question, I think it's a good one. If someone thinks of worship in general, they are probably thinking of these songs. And so they'll have their favorites of other things, of course, but it is a tricky thing. So I do agree with Mark that there is the sense in which this represents the things with the widest reach. I think where it begs the question for me is sort of in the looking at how people learn and looking at how people are formed. If the majority of our time is spent in these things, what does that mean? We could probably spend hours on that, but I think there's a lot there.
Well, just to pick up on that a little bit, I think that we've noticed over the years that there is kind of a generic evangelicalism that is sort of manifesting itself in the evangelical movement. Bruce Clemenger, President Emeritus, likes to say, we all sing worship music from Australia, right? And this is part of the generic brand or feel of evangelical churches. Is there a sense then that this shapes our theology, right? What we sing shapes our theology, and therefore we're kind of becoming the same. And are we really aware of or thoughtful about what is the theology of these worship songs?
Yeah.
I've started enough. I'll back clean up on this one.
Yeah, man. I mean, the short answer, so I could geek out on this all day, to tell you the truth. So I think the dilemma for me is that we sometimes take for granted that people learn very rationally, that it is only the propositional elements of worship music which is formative. I don't know. Maybe it's because I'm into the neuroscience side of things, but I just don't see that to be the case. I think at the end of the day, human beings are complex creatures. So take, for example, the role of emotion. You try to remember a piece of information or an experience and you take emotion out of the equation, it becomes extremely difficult for humans to do. So there is a tension in how we approach worship music, be it popular or otherwise, where without the role of emotion in music and then the way that it helps us to sort of feel something about the information, then the information becomes nothing to us and we don't recall it either. You don't want to be singing the phone book, right? So I think that dance is an important dance. We may have stepped too far one way or the other at times. And I think this part of what we're seeing is, hey, again, this study doesn't directly address lyrical content, although Shannon's work does, and there's plenty of people who do. We're looking at the industry. And I think, if I understand the heart of the question, though, is the tail wagging the dog, as in a sense? Are we allowing the market to drive what gets made instead of marketing what's good for people to have? And I think streaming is going to do that. It's one of the things to remember is that if these churches are now functionally record labels, which they are in almost every case, then on some level, the songs which are the most popular on streaming platforms are beholden to algorithm, at least in the case of Spotify specifically. Apple less so. Apple's more programmed, but Spotify is a software company which has music. And so on some level, that is interfacing with the songs we hear and discover, which will, down the road as we start to explore some of the attitudinal research, there's some really interesting stuff there, I think, in terms of the role this might play. But I think we can't overstate how key that is, because that does mean on some level, persons are driving what floats to the top, and with no filtering for the values of persons, just simply persons who engage in a genre are playing a direct role in discovery of music. That's a new thing. To me, I think that, I don't know. I know that's not a direct answer to the question, but it does sort of speak into it in my mind.
Yeah, and if I can tag in, I would say that the fact that maybe Australia used to be the continent that produced a lot of our generic evangelicalism, of the big four, as we've kind of tagged them for the 2010s decade, it's actually a lot of America. So we've got the other major churches are Bethel, Passion, which a lot of people don't think of as a church, but we highlight the fact that they became, for lack of a better word, a church, and not even just a single church, but a multi-church, multi-site church during that era. And Elevation. And so these churches, the interesting thing is, though they are in some respects the common songbook of our kind of evangelicalism, they hold values that a lot of people don't seem to hold. And that's one thing that, as a pastor, the amount of times that I get forwarded emails and YouTube videos from people that are trying to warn individuals to not sing certain songs from certain churches, it's a weekly basis that I get these things forwarded to me. Now my church, it doesn't work for us because the theological convictions that we hold are not a problem. But I know of churches, I know of actual straight up cessationist churches who will sing songs from Bethel. And so I find it fascinating that the songs themselves stand alone. And in some respects, we want that to be the case, because when Isaac Watts or whoever it is has a fall from grace near the end of their life, we still sing the song. We still sing the songs, right? We don't strike them from our hymn book. And so there is this tension that we kind of walk through where we say the songs themselves are not directly attached to the church or even the theological movement that produces those songs. But in real time, it feels a little bit different for people, I think. So when you can look up the who's and the what's and the what they said yesterday kind of thing, all of that kind of feeds into this strange kind of disconnect that we experience for a lot of churches.
I'm really interested in what the two of you think pastorally about this. We have this shift, this industry shift where essentially the industry is reaching individuals and it's not really being maybe mediated by the church or by pastors. What do you think about that as people in sort of leadership roles? Do you think as a pastor, how are you going to disciple the people that you lead in musical worship? Do you think it's about teaching them to maybe find that larger array of songs that are forming them and shaping what they believe? Or, I don't know, maybe I'll give it to you rather than offering suggestions. So what do you think pastorally, how to approach this or respond?
So if I understand the question correctly, I wasn't alive in the 1800s, but my guess is that not a lot of people showed up to church with sheet music and said this is the song that you should sing today, right? I felt like the world wasn't set up in such a way that people were kind of grassroots ground swelling up from the congregation to the leaders saying, here's some songs that you should lead us in. But that is the way that the world is set up today. So again, the aforementioned Facebook messages, here's my new favorite worship song. a song that they did not learn at our church because we haven't sung it, right? But here's a song that I think that you should lead. And so we end up, as you've already kind of mentioned, Lindsay, like people are, now not everybody, some people don't listen to worship music ever outside of church, but a lot of people do. They have different mediums of getting it, whether it is Spotify or whether it is encountering it at another church, whether it's YouTube. So we used to think that we were the gatekeepers. So I'm old enough to remember that growing up, I would go to a conference, I would hear a song, I'd be like, oh, sweet, I would like to introduce this song to my church. So I would prepare it. I would teach the team. We would say, okay, I'm gonna sing the chorus to you acoustically one time so you can kind of catch on. All right, we'll do the song. We introduced it that one Sunday. We did it 3 Sundays in a row. Took a Sunday off, did it again. Kind of got a sense, okay, it's good. We put it in the songbook, and now it's part of our church's life. Now I can lead a song. And by the time I get to the first chorus, depending on what the song is, if it has kind of like certain saturation in the market, because I'm a laggard, I'm not normally somebody who will do a song right away. So it's already a song that's usually been in the ether for 3 months or whatever by the time I do it. I don't have to work really hard. The congregation's already singing along because they've heard it. They got, whether it happened to be on radio or whether it was on their Facebook wall, it's like it's just there. So in terms of like whether or not we're supposed to be the ones, like as pastors, who help shape the songs they listen to, I don't know, supposed to, not supposed to, the cat's out of the bag. There is no way for us to go ahead and do that at this point in time.
I'll add a twist to that. So statistically, and it probably varies a great deal from church to church. So depending on your church culture. So for example, you may have a church where a large percentage of your congregation might listen to, say, Christian radio or streams Christian music on the DSPs like Spotify and Apple and so on, right? But statistically, it is often the case that there's a big gap between the number of Americans, at least, I don't have this data in Canada, but the number of Americans who report to attend church weekly and the number of Americans who listen to radio on a regular basis or listen to Christian radio. So on paper, actually the case that the market penetration of Christian radio is lower than people think. It's like 1 in 5. So now you may be in a church where 80% of people listen to Christian radio or are streaming Christian music. If that's the case, that's great. Now, in my own church, it would probably be a fairly small percentage of people who listen to Christian radio, and they would stream some worship music or have a few Christian artists they really like. But by and large, they're not a CCM listening group, right? And in my travels, which came up often, I found it difficult depending on, my band was a little bit in the sort of alternative worship space. And so there was that where some of the people who were coming out to events we would lead might not be Christian radio listeners, and they might be at the same, it's just a weird mixed bag. And so the only safe bet was the top 5 songs because you knew that their church was probably singing it too. From a pastoral formational standpoint, I think it does present us with challenges. I think as a writer and someone who thinks of worship music as deeply formative, it challenges me to say, am I writing songs that cover the breadth of the material needed? Am I being thoughtful in how and what I'm doing? And to be perfectly honest, I would expect that the majority of writers writing the songs in the top 25 are doing some version of that same thing. Actually, Phil Wickham is one of the characters in this list. I spoke to him last week on the phone. We're friends in advance of the article that came out. And he sent me a song, which is a great song that's very much wrestling with what it means to follow the way of Jesus in various challenging contexts of life. Whether or not that song is a hit or not, I know Phil is wrestling with that question. I know Phil is wrestling with those themes. So I think it's sort of what Mark was pointing to earlier in that, like, there is a breadth to hymnody, if you will, modern hymnody, but as to whether or not they make the top 25 is really the question. So I would love to think that the average worship pastor could put a degree of intention into spreading it out a little more. In other words, saying, hey, if right now 4 out of 5 songs we sing are from the top 20 or top 50, what if it was 2 or 3, and then we were more intentional to slowly repeat songs that broaden our kind of theological wrestling, I guess, in the context of a morning. Beyond that, I think there's not a lot you can do because, like Mark said, the cat's out of the bag. People are going and listening to music. It's going to be tough to steer a ship which is driven by persons who work for Apple and Spotify and so on at the end of the day. They have shareholders to answer to. That's the reality of it.
Yeah, that's right. So maybe, toward the end there, you kind of mentioned songwriters. If they're not connected to sort of these bigger mega churches, do you see a way forward for them if they do want to get, it's hard. You don't want to say that they're looking for platform or accolades, but is there hope for them if they want their work to be sung in a larger breadth of churches?
Well, two things. First, our research is exclusively dealing with 2010 through 2020. I think in the wake of the events since 2020, COVID and onward, and some of the scandals that have happened, we're already seeing that many of the players who we would have easily affiliated with these movements in that decade are now releasing solo records, and which doesn't necessarily change the relevance of how worship leaders might view them and how worship leaders might weigh these churches. But we're already starting to see a shift, is I guess what I'm driving at. It was interesting for me. I mean, the City Harmonic was my band. We were sort of semi-popular in spaces from 2010 through 2017. So like the entire, span of this project, essentially. And to some degree, not operated with the goal of becoming the biggest thing in worship or anything. We were focused primarily on church unity. And we were grateful for the success that we did have. But there was in the back of our head a belief in what turns out to be a myth, which was that without associating with one of these 5 or 4 plus North Point, we were going to crack the top 25 or whatever. That's always in the back of your mind, and it looks like it would not have likely happened. Now, a very specific example is my song Manifesto, where Charlie Hall led that song at Passion 2013. Because they play a lot of songs at Passion, the song didn't make the record. Anecdotally, I know some reasons for it. And I sort of have believed a long time, hey man, it feels like if that song had been on that record, the Passion 2013 album, that perhaps the average worship leader would have been warmer to trying it at their church. And I think there's something to that. But as to whether or not you can just put out a great song and make a big difference in the world, I don't know at this point. Partly because so many of our best examples at the moment didn't do that. So it's hard to say. But having been through the ringer in the decade we're exploring, I don't have regrets in a sense. We had enough success that we were able to sustain something meaningful, and it was a great springboard for meaningful ministry and important work. Whether I won at the game or not, I don't know. That's what it looks more like to me, is that it is hard to be the winner of the game if that's what you're trying to do at the moment, or at least in that decade, without the help or association with these church movements. Yeah,
that's fair. That's a good way of putting it.
It's an infinite game, as they say. So if you're playing just to win, then you probably hop out now.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Yeah. And then, you have this sense of the Lord superintending over what his church is singing and what is bringing him glory. And there's that element as well. Just by way of wrapping up, where can people learn more about the research that you're doing?
So worshipleaderresearch.com is the hub for our actual articles. Again, they're being kind of shared through various kind of news media outlets as well. But if you want to go right to the horse's mouth, worshipleaderresearch.com. That same moniker is across the socials. So we're on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and TikTok with Worship Leader Research.
Great. We'll link to those in the show notes. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Lindsay, Mark and Elias, these guys are so much fun to interview. And I think a lot of the concern around the idea of concentration of worship music came out in the interview, that there's a cabal there. And I sometimes think about historically, how did worship music get discovered? I think even when I was a teenager, we didn't have Spotify, but I would go to the local Christian bookstore. They would have sample tapes that you could put in a cassette player with headphones right there, and you would listen to worship music, and often you would just take a chance on a cassette. But even then, you still had a handful of record labels that were pushing out either worship music or Christian music really generally. But I think that this resonates with a lot of people, because I would say that as a teenager, a lot of the Christian music that I consumed through tapes formed my faith. I look back on it now, and some of it I sort of shudder that was forming me. But music does have a really powerful role in shaping our beliefs. And I think that that's why we're so concerned about it. Do we really want producers or algorithms or a few big companies having this much influence in our beliefs?
Right. No, we don't. I don't think we do. And you know, it was mentioned, I think, that the producers are going to be concerned with what is going to be consumed. And so it does, even though a lot of the content of these songs are still going to be Christian, how distinctly Christian? Is it watering down themes? Is it a narrowing of themes? These are things that I think that we can measurably track. It's not covering the breadth of content that is necessary for robust discipleship or real theological reflection across the board. I think these songs definitely have a role in real theological reflection in certain areas, but they are maybe limiting. And so, I mean, call me old-fashioned. I do like the idea of the leadership of the church having a role in selecting songs that we just don't want to hear, but that we need to hear. And I think both Mark and Elias mentioned this in the interview. Again, that's going to happen for maybe 30 minutes on a Sunday morning, but they can't control what people are consuming outside of the church context. I don't know how we reclaim that. I mean, I do that. I listen to Spotify. I listen to the worship music on there. I tend to listen to whole albums. I'm not sure if that makes a difference. I don't know if these bands are curating their albums in a way in which the album is serving as a mini hymn book. But I do see, you know, I was thinking of what are ways in which maybe the Christian music industry has a opportunity to look different than the secular music industry. And one way that I can think of is I can access a lot of the songs that we listen to as a family. I can access the sheet music for free, and I can access it in a key that I can sing in, and I can access it in a level of difficulty so that I can actually play the piano as poorly as I do. And so I'm able to download some sheet music. I can pluck my way through the songs in a range that's comfortable for me to sing in, and I can play it with my kids. And so I think there are opportunities with this access to actually be able to foster environments of worship in our own homes. And I appreciate that I can do it for free. Whereas before I would have to pay some of those fees in order to download the music, or I would have to go into a store and buy the book that would be, you know, a bit of a chunk out of our budget. So just some thoughts about how I've appreciated some of those changes in access.
You know, this story has been framed as a story about music coming through for churches, but it's really a story about a different technology for distributing music, whether it's through the streaming services. You know, Mark was talking about how if you introduce a new song, chances are you're not introducing it because people already know about it. Mm-hmm. And I think that probably more than about the content, we have to think about how the new streaming services really change what are the real options that are available to pastors. And I think that's probably the bigger story here. You know, when we talk, I'm a real big fan of Marshall McLuhan and his idea that the meaning of technology is not the content it delivers, but the way that it changes our relationships with other people and the scale of our lives. And this is about that change. And somewhere in that, the meaning of this story lies in understanding how streaming services have changed our relationship with music and our relationship with those who produce it.
Absolutely. And I think our relationship, even with our worship pastors, I mean, Mark even said, my role as a worship pastor has changed because of this. And I think, mentioning Marshall McLuhan, it hits the nail on the head. It's the media has shaped sort of the message.
Thanks for listening. Find out more about the EFC's research at www.theefc.ca/research.